Welcome to Author's Note. This is a significant week in Hungary, where the new central bank governor, György Matolcsy, has just announced his first interest rate decision. It's a cut of 25 basis points, reducing borrowing rates to their lowest ever, 5%. Now, the forint has had a tough time this year as one of the world's weakest emerging markets currencies, and also one of the more volatile. What will be the impact and what is the outlook now for the forint? Here with me to talk about this is Neil Buckley, the FT's East Europe editor. Now Neil, if we look at this chart, we see that the forint has been slipping pretty quickly this year. What impact do you think the interest rate decision will have on all this?
Well, the forint, I think, is likely to remain under pressure because markets are still quite cautious towards György Matolcsy, who's taken over at the central bank as governor. As you'll remember, Mr. Matolcsy was the architect of Hungary's unorthodox economic policies in the last few years. And a lot of this pressure you've seen on the forint since February was linked to the expectation that Mr. Matolcsy would take over at the central bank and that he might begin similarly unorthodox policies at the central bank. Now, the move on Tuesday of just cutting by 25 basis points seems to be fairly cautious, and the initial reaction were the forint rose somewhat, but I think markets and investors are still waiting to see what the Matolcsy governorship will mean.
And there are some clues, aren't there, in the statement that he put out, which is definitely dovish.
Yes, he cancelled the traditional press conference after the central bank decision, so it makes it a little bit more difficult to work out exactly what is in his mind or in the minds of the MPC in Hungary. But in the statement they said inflationary pressures are easing and therefore there may be scope for further cuts later in the year, or in the coming months. But I think as well as the weaker monetary or looser monetary policy, I think what investors are concerned about is other kinds of more unorthodox policy. For example, some kind of action to ease the burden on Hungary's many holders of foreign currency loans and mortgages.
And all this comes against a background in which Victor Orbán, the Prime Minister, has thoroughly annoyed Hungary's potential assistants and allies. EU partners, for example, and the IMF.
Yeah, I think that's also been a factor in the background for investors and for markets. I think they've been focusing perhaps more on what's going on at the central bank and the new governorship, but it doesn't help the general sentiment surrounding Hungary that there has been this clash recently with other European partners and with the European institutions over the changes that Hungary is making to its constitution, which some are suggesting, some critics are saying, could weaken democratic checks and balances in Hungary.
Yeah. But if we look at this next chart, we see something really quite interesting. We see that the forint's weakness is not a product of the last few months or even of the Orbán administration since 2010. It goes back a long way. Can you tell us why that is? What's behind this?
Yes, it's very interesting. If you look here at this chart, the forint has significantly underperformed the Polish zloty and the Czech koruna way back since the early 2000s, which in a sense strengthens Mr. Orbán's argument that there was a long period of mismanagement by the previous socialist government. That's what he's always said, that he's correcting mistakes that took place earlier on. But one thing to remember is that Mr. Orbán himself and his Fidesz party were in power until 2002. They had made some big spending promises in order to try and win re-election. They lost that election, and then the socialist government decided they needed to stick with the Orbán program, if you like. And so at least some of the seeds of this spending problem, which then put pressure on the forint and the economy generally, some of the seeds for that were planted during the previous Orbán administration.
Thanks, Neil. So there you have it. The origins of the forint's weakness go back much further than the events of the last few weeks, and responsibility reaches much further than the current central bank governor and even his very powerful Prime Minister.